Number 10. Submerged Vehicle Museum. In 2019, Jordanian authorities lowered 19 decommissioned military vehicles into the Red Sea in hopes of attracting divers to the nearby resort city of Aqaba. The collection of drowned machinery includes tanks, an ambulance, a military crane, a troop carrier, a combat helicopter, an anti-aircraft battery, and several guns. They're arranged in a tactical formation along a coral reef 92 feet below the waves. The project was the brainchild of the Aqaba Special Economic Zone Authority, which has turned to wreck diving in recent years as a way to draw visitors and their money. In fact, most of the wrecks around Aqaba were sunk on purpose. The tradition of deliberately scuttling vehicles also stems from the Jordanian royal family's passion for diving, which goes back generations. In 1985, the late King Abdullah ordered the sinking of a Spanish cargo vessel called the Cedar Pride. 3 years earlier, an accident had blasted a hole in the ship, leaving a half-submerged eyesore until the king decided it belonged on the bottom of the sea. In 1999, an anti-aircraft tank became the second intentionally placed wreck off Aqaba. There are also a few sunken airplanes, a landing boat, and a crane barge. Number 9. Monstrous extinct sea scorpion. During the 1990s, an Australian man named Nick Freeman discovered the fossil of a sea creature on his family property in the rural Queensland town of Theodore. He alerted staff from the Queensland Museum who weren't sure what kind of animal the strange fossil belongs to. They had never seen anything like it before. They ultimately chucked the specimen into the too hard to identify category with plans to revisit it when they had time. This opportunity to study fossil cold cases arose during COVID-19 related closures in 2020 and 2021. The team identified it as a member of an extinct group of invertebrates known as sea scorpions. Dubbed Woodwardopterus freemanorum, it's the only sea scorpion ever found in Queensland. Despite its classification as a sea scorpion, it lived in freshwater lakes or rivers. The species probably reached over 3 feet in length. It would have been one of the largest predators in its environment. W. freemanorum lived around 252 million years ago. It was the last creature of its kind to exist anywhere in the world, right before the end Permian extinction event that killed off 90% of the planet's species. The ability for experts to carry out long-awaited work that sat on the back burner until the pandemic hit is one of the few upsides to the disruptions that COVID-19 has brought us. Number 8. Long missing car and person. Alberta Lehman of Gorham, New Hampshire disappeared almost 44 years ago in 1978. Investigators believe that she was on her way home when her 1972 Pontiac Lehmans vanished seemingly into thin air. Over the next 40 years, numerous searches failed to yield any sign of Miss Lehman or her vehicle. In 2018, the case was assigned to a team led by Fish and Game Conservation Officer Joe Canfield. They researched the disappearance and spoke with retired law enforcement officials who worked the case and decided to search a specific part of the Connecticut River in Lancaster, New Hampshire. Using new sonar equipment acquired through federal funding, the team finally found Alberta's long-missing vehicle. Inside were human remains. According to the last update, the remains hadn't been identified, but the license plate on the car matched the one connected to Alberta's vehicle, strongly suggesting that her body has been recovered. No foul play is suspected, but the discovery marks the first step in bringing closure to Alberta's surviving family members, including her daughter Nancy, who stood on the shore of the river during the most recent search for answers. Number 7. Ancient Egyptian warship. At its peak around 2,400 years ago, the ancient city of Tanis Heracleion was Egypt's largest port. Its ruins are submerged in Abu Qir Bay off the Alexandria coast, where archaeologists discovered a wrecked warship last year. Found beneath the crumbled ruins of a destroyed temple and 16 feet of clay, the ship dates back to Thonis Heracleion's final years of existence. The 82-foot-long vessel's shape suggests that it was built for speed, indicating it was not meant for carrying passengers or cargo. Based on its flat bottom and keel, which are useful for traveling in shallow water, experts believe the ship was built for use in the Nile River. Thonis Heracleion was a melting pot of Egyptian and Greek culture. This much is evident in the Abu Qir Bay warship, which features a blend of Greek shipbuilding techniques and Egyptian design and construction. Researchers believe that it was built somewhere in Egypt using repurposed wood from older ships. During the 2nd century BC, a series of catastrophic earthquakes and tsunamis began to destroy the city. The clay ground liquefied, collapsing buildings and causing large stone blocks from the Temple of Amun to crush the warship. Despite this, the vessel is impressively well preserved thanks to the clay that buried it. It's only the second Egyptian warship from the Ptolemaic period that has ever been found. Number 6. Largest ever underwater eruption. In 2018, an earthquake shook the island of Mayotte, which is located in the Indian Ocean between East Africa and Madagascar. It was caused by a volcanic event that generated 11,000 more earthquakes. In what became known as the largest underwater eruption ever recorded, a 2,690-foot-tall volcano was created on the sea floor. Eruptions are nothing new in the area. In fact, the newly created volcano sits along a 31-mile-long ridge that was created by other lava flows, and the seismic events created by the volcanoes appear to be ongoing. In 2019, a scientific team detected around 17,000 of these events occurring between 12 and 31 miles below the ocean floor. Based on data they collected in the region, the researchers determined that tectonic processes probably damaged the Earth's crust and mantle, causing magma to spew to the surface and creating the new volcano in the process. As of 2021, the underwater earthquakes were still happening, and the seafloor was becoming even more deformed. The most surprising aspect of the discovery is that it marks the first time earthquakes have been detected off Mayotte. And before 2018, the most recent known volcanic activity in the area happened between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. Have you ever felt an earthquake before? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 5. Vintage Bugatti. In 2009, a 1925 Bugatti Type 22 Brescia Roadster was recovered from the bottom of Lake Maggiore along the border between Switzerland and Italy. It was heavily rusted and damaged after spending 73 years underwater, but it nevertheless sold for around $400,000 at auction. Records reveal that the car was registered to a French address when it ended up in Lake Maggiore in 1935. The previous year, Grand Prix driver René Dreyfus had reportedly lost it to Swiss playboy Adalbert Baudet during a drunken poker game. Adalbert allegedly tried to bring the car into Switzerland, but didn't want to pay the hefty import taxes that came along with doing so. So he told the authorities to do whatever they wanted with the Bugatti, and they supposedly responded by rolling it into Lake Maggiore. At the time, the vehicle wasn't worth much. In 1967, it was rediscovered by a driver named Hugo Pillon. A local drive club finally rescued it more than 40 years later with plans to sell it and put the proceeds toward a charity that combats youth violence. Peter Mullen, who owns the Mullen Automotive Museum in California, bought the Bugatti and put it on display there. Instead of restoring it, he left it as is in an exhibit that recreates the feeling of being at the bottom of a lake. Number 4. Submerged Forest. Off the Alabama coast in the Gulf of Mexico, there's an ancient cypress forest that once stood on dry land. The trees sprouted in a swamp along the banks of a river sometime between 42,000 and 70,000 years ago, during the early part of the last ice age. At some point, something killed them and buried them in sediment. As the climate warmed around 18,000 years ago, sea levels rose and ocean waters moved inland, engulfing the buried swamp. The forest sat undisturbed until 2004 when Hurricane Ivan disturbed the seabed in what is now Mobile Bay. Journalist Ben Raines discovered the shockingly intact trees 8 miles offshore, sitting 60 feet beneath the waves. Wood normally decomposes in the ocean, but the trees were remarkably well preserved from being buried in sediment, where they were protected from oxygen and shipworms. Wood samples collected by scientists reportedly still smelled of freshly cut cypress, according to Dr. Christine DeLong, who's participating in ongoing research on the forest. Her team also collected sediment cores, which revealed an unusual mixture of dark peat that resembles potting soil beneath a top layer of sand and seashells. Toward the bottoms of the cores, there were leaves and roots. DeLong is working with tree and plant experts to learn more about the unusual specimens that have been found. Researchers don't know what type of event caused the swamp to become buried, but they believe that there may be more submerged ancient forests near the Gulf Coast waiting to be discovered. Number 3. Ancient Landscape. During a deep dive in the Gulf of Aqaba in the northern Red Sea, geoscientist Sam Purkis and other scientists noticed an alarming break in the seabed 3,000 feet below the waves. Suspecting that this was more than a simple crack, they had the pilot turn around. It was then that the pair observed a 15-foot-high fissure stretching across the sea floor. Purkis could tell that a tremendous geological force had caused the massive break. In a recent study, his team concluded that an underwater landslide happened around 500 years ago, followed by a catastrophic tsunami. In his words, the seabed moved, causing part of a reef slope to drop several meters and get stuck beneath a large quantity of rock that hangs over it. These findings warn of the possibility of another underwater landslide, which would trigger another tsunami. In fact, if the rock wall Purkis discovered collapsed, the ensuing tsunami would be much bigger than the one that happened centuries ago. Based on computer simulations, the ancient landslide may have produced a 30-foot-high tsunami wave, which would have been extremely deadly. The coastline is more populated now than it was 500 years ago, and an even bigger wave would undoubtedly lead to unspeakable disaster. The effects could devastate bustling coastal towns in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. None of these countries have an effective early warning system for earthquakes and tsunamis, but Perkis recommended developing them. He said that a lot of movement happens in the region and that it wouldn't take much to collapse the wall. Number 2. Extinct sponge gardens. Food is sparse enough beneath the ice covering the Arctic Ocean, where algae production is limited by the lack of light that reaches the water. So it was surprising to researchers when they discovered natural sponge gardens growing on extinct underwater volcanoes called seamounts near the North Pole in 2016. This sprawling 300-year-old ecosystem is living evidence that sponges can survive in places that were previously thought to be uninhabitable. Found on the Langseth Ridge in the Central Arctic Ocean, these massive sponge gardens are clearly thriving. At first, the team that discovered them was unsure of what they ate to stay so robust in a habitat that's largely devoid of nutrition. They later determined that the sponges feed on the remnants of dead creatures that once lived on the seamounts. The findings speak to the resilient nature of sponges, which are found in a variety of environments throughout all the world's oceans. Many host a community of microorganisms, which facilitates the production of antibiotics, the elimination of waste, and the transfer of nutrients. This helps to explain how the sponge gardens have a similar biomass to specimens that live in shallow waters and have a much higher nutrient intake. Number 1. Toxic waste. Toxic dumping is nothing new. Companies that don't want to spend money disposing of their waste properly often do what's easy and illegally toss it into the ocean. But just because the activity is common doesn't make it any less disturbing whenever a hazardous waste is found on the sea floor. Last year, a team of scientists discovered more than 25,000 chemical barrels off the California coast near Santa Catalina Island. The containers, which are thought to contain DDT waste, cover an area twice the size of Manhattan. Even the experts who expected to encounter a large amount of rubbish were shocked by how much of it they found. It shows that the offshore dumping went on for decades, and it's even more disturbing to realize that this is just one of many sites where dangerous chemicals were carelessly discarded into the sea. Developed during the 1940s, DDT is a tasteless, colorless insecticide that was originally used to kill insects that spread diseases like typhus and malaria. Mounting evidence of the chemical's threats to wildlife and the environment and its link to cancer and other diseases in humans led to a worldwide ban in 1972. So it's alarming to learn that copious amounts of the highly toxic substance may be sitting in barrels on the ocean floor. What's more is that there are no easy answers regarding what to do with the waste. Removing the barrels or encasing them in cement would be extremely expensive, and disturbing the site could break open the barrels and cause even more damage to the environment. Thanks for watching. Which of these discoveries is the coolest to you?
Number 9. German U-boat. When World War I ended, Germany surrendered over 100 U-boats. Most were simply scrapped, but some were given to the French Navy. And one lone submarine somehow ended up on the muddy bank of the River Medway in Kent, England. It's known as UB-122, and it has sat at its current resting place for over a century. The vessel is believed to be one of the surrendered U-boats. During the war, it would have carried 10 torpedoes. Later on, its engines were cut out and used to power a cement factory. It's unclear why the rest of the submarine wasn't scrapped, especially since the materials would have come in handy during World War II. It's possible that the tow line pulling the boat broke, and that it seemed like more trouble than it was worth to chase down. UB-122 is the only complete U-boat that has ever been found in British tidal waters, according to marine archaeologist Mark Dunkley, who spoke with Mail Online. And it's the only visible evidence of the more than 40 U-boat wrecks that happened in British waters, but there are no plans as of yet to preserve it. The partially buried vehicle's visibility changes with the water levels. It's gained a lot of attention in recent years after being exposed by a series of harsh storms, but the submarine will continue to deteriorate, and it'll probably eventually disappear. Number 8. Eureka City. Some of the oldest geological formations on Earth can be found in South Africa's Maconjwa Mountains, which serve as a scenic backdrop to the modern-day town of Barberton. Dating back more than 3.5 billion years, the mountains represent one of the first landmasses that emerged from the ocean at a time when the planet was covered by a global ocean. New residents flocked to the remote region after a man named Edwin Bray found gold there in 1885. The so-called Golden Quarry went down in history as the richest gold mine ever worked by human hands. Settlers established a town called Eureka City, and within a year, it boasted 3 shops, 3 hotels, a bakery, a chemist, a racecourse, a music hall, and bars. By 1887, Eureka City had a population of at least 700 people. But like most boom towns, the settlement eventually went bust. When the gold supply dried up, residents left in search of opportunities elsewhere, leaving behind a ghost town that fell into ruin. The once bustling site is now eerily quiet. All that's left of Eureka City are the crumbling remnants of some of its buildings, including a former hotel and faded ox wagon tracks. What little exists of the ruins helps to tell the story of a place that once attracted hopeful fortune seekers who came from far and wide, determined to hit it big. Number 7. Belchite. From 1936 to 1939, Spain was bitterly divided in a violent civil war between fascist rebels and the Republican government. In the country's arid and remote northeastern region, a small town called Belchite found itself caught along the war's front lines. Belchite was controlled by the Nationalist Army until September of 1937, when the Republicans captured it following a weeks-long siege. By then, the town was almost completely destroyed. Author Cecil D. Eby wrote that the destruction was so extensive that people could hardly tell where any of the streets were. He also described witnesses seeing dead bodies being pulled from beneath piles of mortar, bricks, and other debris. The stench was unbearable, and the scene was littered with mule carcasses and people's personal belongings, including sewing machines, cooking pots, and other everyday items. Belchite was taken in 1938 by nationalist forces under the command of General Francisco Franco, who later became the country's fascist dictator after securing his victory. Instead of razing the town's ruins, he left the site as a war monument. People continued to live there for another 15 years until a new village was built nearby. Today, the ruins look much like they did when they were abandoned. The hallmarks of brutal warfare are evident in the bullet-riddled buildings, the piles of rubble, and the other damage left behind. Visitors hoping to catch a glimpse of this dark chapter can take guided tours. Number 6. Spinalonga. Throughout history, governments and leaders established leper colonies in remote places where sufferers were forcefully kept at a distance from mainstream society. The small Greek island of Spinalonga was therefore an ideal place for keeping patients conveniently out of sight and out of mind. Spinalonga's history dates back to Venetian times. It served as a fortress under Ottoman rule from 1715 until 1900. Then, in 1903, a leper colony was established there. Located off the coast of Crete, the island was once home to nearly 400 residents. They were banished there after having their property and assets seized and their citizenship revoked as a punishment for a condition that was completely out of their control. At its peak, the colony consisted of a main street filled with shops, as well as a cafe and a school. While the community strived to give themselves some sense of normalcy, they lacked access to a lot of the things that are available to people in the free world. Only one doctor served the population, and he only visited if someone had an ailment unrelated to their leprosy. The disease became curable in the 1940s, but the stigma against lepers persisted, and the colony of Spinalonga continued to operate until the Greek government shut it down in 1957. This was done as quietly as possible, and the authorities were careful to destroy any and all records of its existence. They were planning to eliminate all physical traces of the colony, but they had a change of heart when they realized that the ruins attract visitors. Today, the island is uninhabited. Parts of the former community have been restored, and Spinalonga is Crete's second most popular tourist attraction. Efforts are being made to designate it as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Number 5. Nrut Mountain Tomb. King Antiochus I ruled the Greco-Iranian kingdom of Commagene from 70 to 31 BC. He established a cult that followed a belief system of mixed Greek and Zoroastrian elements. The ideology was designed to ensure that Antiochus would be worshipped after his death. In keeping with his grand view of himself, the ruler had a tomb built for himself 8 years into his reign. He chose the 7,000-foot-high summit of Mount Nemrut in southeastern Turkey's Taurus mountain range, which would put him as close as possible to the gods. Today, the site consists of a collection of large limestone statues measuring up to 30 feet tall. The sculptures include depictions of the king himself, along with lions, eagles, and various Greek gods, including Zeus, Hercules, and Apollo. Their heads were broken off at some point for unknown reasons and remain scattered throughout the property. This may have been done in an act of iconoclasm, which is when icons and monuments are destroyed for political or religious reasons. But the statues aren't completely ruined, and some even still bear their original inscriptions. Experts believe that King Antiochus was buried at his self-dedicated shrine, but his remains have never been found. And this is just one of the several mysteries about what exactly went on at the site. But unfortunately, we may never know the answers to these questions. Do you have any thoughts on where King Antiochus might be buried? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Number 4. Rare lava lakes. Even with advanced modern technology, there are some places in the world that are simply difficult to explore. One of them, known as Saunders Island, is part of a subantarctic archipelago known as the South Sandwich Islands. It's home to an active volcano called Mount Michael, which on most days is hidden from satellite and overhead view by a layer of clouds or the plum spewing from its top. Scientists knew starting in the 1990s that something odd was going on there. They detected a thermal anomaly, leading them to suspect that the volcano's crater contained a lava lake. But the imagery was of somewhat low quality, and it was impossible for experts to determine if the lava represented a stable feature or a temporary pool. A team revisited the matter in 2019 after getting their hands on 30 years worth of higher resolution satellite images. They found that the crater's lava supply is stable, making it the 7th known lava lake ever found. The 360-foot wide lake is roughly the size of 8 Olympic swimming pools. Its hottest sections reach temperatures between 543 and nearly 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Lead study author Danielle Gray pointed out that the research techniques her team used could come in handy for monitoring other volcanoes that are inaccessible due to their location, political instability, or other factors that make it unsafe to visit. There are a handful of other known lava lakes in remote places, including Antarctica's Mount Erebus, the Ertael volcano in Ethiopia, the Ambrim crater and Mount Yasur in the Vanuatu Islands, and the Masaya volcano in Nicaragua. One of the largest lava lakes can be found on the summit of the Nyiragongo volcano in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Unlike most of the other known lava lakes throughout the world, the 700-foot-long pool of violently churning orange liquid and deadly gases sits above a highly populated region. Hundreds of people have died in past eruptions, and with as many as 1.5 million residents now living in the volcano's shadow, even more lives are at risk. So it's probably for the best that most lava lakes are in places with few or no people nearby. Number 3. Laupola. In the dense forest of France's northernmost region, there's a massive World War II-era Nazi bunker known as Laupola. The concrete structure was intended as a launch base for V-2 rockets against London and other parts of southern England, and for storing stockpiles of fuel, rockets, and warheads. Built into the side of a disused chalk quarry, it's the earliest known precursor to modern-day underground missile silos. Laupola was built above a network of underground tunnels consisting of storage areas, launch facilities, and living quarters for crew members. The Germans planned to launch dozens of missiles daily and did their best to keep the site a secret from the Allies. But before the complex was finished, the site was heavily bombed in a campaign codenamed Operation Crossbow. Construction ground to a halt, and Laupola never entered service. The Allies captured the bunker in late 1944, and it sat unused and neglected until the 1990s. In 1997, it opened to the public as a museum dedicated to telling the story of the German occupation of France during World War II, as well as the development of V-2 rockets. There's also a 3D planetarium that offers a 360-degree simulated view of the night sky. Number 2. First arrivals to the Pharaoh Islands. The Pharaoh Islands are a rocky archipelago located in the North Atlantic between Iceland and Norway. For a long time, scientists believed that the first settlers to arrive there were a group of Vikings, and it makes sense, given the lasting influence their culture has had on the region. In fact, modern-day residents speak a dialect of the Old Norse language that was brought there by their ancestors. But researchers made a groundbreaking discovery last year that stands to rewrite the history of the Faroe Islands. As it turns out, ancient British or Irish people may have settled there before the Vikings arrived during the 9th century. Sheep DNA and feces found on the island of Eysturoy was dated to 500 AD, and the only way sheep could have reached the remote area was by boat. So it's clear that humans must have transported the animals there. But who these people were and what brought them to the Faroe Islands is still a mystery. Speaking with the BBC, Dr. William DeAndrea described the group's presence on Eysturoy as like being an on-off switch, based on the DNA of modern residents and Celtic grave markers that were left behind. He said that these early inhabitants were probably from the British Isles. But these suspicions are controversial and unproven, leaving the debate open for now. Number 1. Out-of-place rocks. Situated in the Indian Ocean between Madagascar and Africa's east coast, Anzuan Island is part of the remote Comoros Islands archipelago. The 163 square mile landmass was formed by volcanic eruptions and is therefore largely made up of igneous volcanic rock. But scientists were left baffled after discovering a large amount of non-volcanic rock on Anzuan Island in 2018. They recently confirmed long-standing rumors of a heavy quartzite presence there, but are unable to explain how it got there. Quartzite is not typically found on volcanic islands. It's associated with the lighter-colored, less dense rocks that continental plates are made of. Anzuan Island is in a region that lacks the usual components of quartzite formation, yet half an entire mountain there is made from it. Locals have long known about the quartzite, which they use for sharpening knives, but searching the island for it is difficult due to the thick layer of vegetation that covers most of it. Now that scientists have started documenting and analyzing the discoveries, they hope to figure out how the out-of-place rock ended up there. The first step is to determine how old the quartzite is, which could help the team identify where it originated. They also plan to study other types of rock that are found on Anzuan Island in hopes that a better understanding of its geological past will help solve the mystery.
Number 9. USS Arizona and USS Utah. The American battleship USS Arizona was built in 1916 during the First World War, but it saw little combat before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. It fought fiercely in the battle that led to the U.S. officially entering World War II, but this would be the last action that the Arizona participated in. It was bombed during the attack and sank to the ocean floor, taking 1,177 service members along with it. An older battleship called the USS Utah was also destroyed at Pearl Harbor when it was struck by a torpedo. Navy divers spent the next several years recovering turrets, sensitive material, machinery, live ammunition, and masts from the Arizona wreck. They also brought 105 bodies to the surface, but their efforts were cut short due to safety concerns and the emotional impacts of the work. The remaining individuals were declared buried at sea. The Arizona and Utah represent 2 out of 3 ships that never returned to service after the attack. Both remain on the seafloor to this very day. The third ship, USS Oklahoma, was raised and then sold for scrap, but it was destroyed in a storm before it could be dismantled. The wrecks went unexamined for decades until the 1980s when the National Park Service took over the site's management. It wasn't until then that divers discovered that one of the Arizona's turrets had survived the attack, despite the long-held belief that all of its turrets had been destroyed. This is just one example of the many things that the submerged battleships have taught researchers. It just goes to show that if the wrecks weren't there to study, then a lot of what happened at Pearl Harbor would be a complete mystery. Number 8. Swedish Atlantis. While diving off the Swedish coast in the Baltic Sea back in 2014, a team of divers discovered a rare cache of submerged Stone Age artifacts. Dubbed Sweden's Atlantis, the site may represent one of the oldest Nordic settlements ever found. Its contents were left behind by a nomadic tribe roughly 11,000 years ago. The artifacts include wood and flint tools, carvings, animal horns, ropes, and bones belonging to an extinct cattle species and ancestor of modern-day bovines known as the auroch. Thanks to their placement in a black, gel-like sediment called gytja, which is made from decaying peat, the items were found in remarkable condition for their age. The items must have become encased in the oxygen-free substance not long after they were submerged. Archaeologists who identified the site as part of a bigger, long-term excavation project hope to eventually find burials there. This would qualify Swedish Atlantis as an actual settlement rather than a temporary camp for a group of ancient nomads. Experts were quick to point out that despite its nickname, the site is not the fabled lost civilization that the Greek philosopher Plato wrote about. After all, most researchers don't believe that Atlantis ever actually existed, and they certainly don't want to add any existing confusion to the matter. Number 7. Aboriginal settlements. When the first people arrived in Australia around 65,000 years ago, sea levels were much lower than they are today. As the planet cooled and entered the most recent ice age, these levels fell even more, extending coastlines much further than where they currently stand. To give you an idea, sea levels were 427 feet lower than they are now when the ice age peaked around 20,000 years ago. These early Australian inhabitants, known as Aborigines, built settlements in places that were swallowed by the ocean when the climate warmed significantly between 18,000 and 8,000 years ago. While working off the country's northwestern coast last year, archaeologists made the first discoveries of underwater Aboriginal settlements. The 2 sites had slowly sunk beneath the waves toward the end of the Ice Age. One settlement, located off the Dampier Archipelago, contains hundreds of stone tools which were found sitting just 8 feet underwater. The other site sits 46 feet underwater. It yielded at least one stone cutting tool made from locally sourced materials. Both settlements are at least 7,000 years old. The people who established these sites along the coast traveled to Australia by boat from what is now Indonesia. Scientists are sure that there are more submerged Aboriginal settlements waiting to be discovered, and that studying them will help resolve unanswered questions about the movement of prehistoric humans. Number 6. Strange Blue Blob. A groundbreaking study has just announced the discovery of a region of mysteriously cooling water in the North Atlantic that appears to be protecting glaciers from the harmful effects of climate change. Scientists believe that this so-called blue blob may help the region cool for another 3 decades. But they're not sure exactly how it formed. They do have a few theories which are discussed in the newly published research. Located just south of Greenland and Iceland, the water reached its coldest point during the 2014-2015 winter. Thanks to the blob, ocean surface temperatures were 2.52 degrees Fahrenheit colder than normal that year. Using climate models and field observations, a team of researchers proved that the unusually cold water is chilling the region effectively enough to slow down the melting of its glaciers. And if their predictions are correct, this will continue to happen until 2050. This may seem like fantastic news, but there is a downside. It seems as though the effects will be temporary and that climate change will ultimately defeat this cooling mechanism. After the blue blob's effects wear off, glacial melting will once again accelerate and air temperatures will also rise. Simply put, the only real way to mitigate the effects of climate change is for humans to take deliberate action against the disastrous impacts of our own activities. After all, researchers believe that we are triggering the current era of climate change, so it's on us to do what we can to stop it. Can you think of anything you can do personally that would help our planet? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to subscribe. Number 5. Atlet Yam. Back in 1984, a marine archaeologist named Ehud Galili discovered the submerged ruins of an ancient fishing village off Israel's Carmel coast, 33 feet beneath the waves. Known as Atlet Yam, the settlement dates back between 6900 and 6300 BC. As one of the world's best preserved prehistoric underwater villages, it offers a rare glimpse at pre-pottery Neolithic society. Excavations at the 10-acre site uncovered houses, burials, and an interesting semicircular arrangement of 7 monolithic stones that once surrounded a spring. The settlement also contains the earliest known examples of deliberately built freshwater wells. Additionally, scientists recovered the remains of 100 plant species, including plants that were purposely grown, as well as those that grew naturally and were gathered. They also found wild and domestic fish and animal bones. Residents enjoyed good health and exceptionally long lives compared to most people in the world at the time. On average, the villagers at Atlet Yam lived to around 50 years old. Their balanced diet may have contributed to their longevity, but some challenges were inescapable, including disease. In fact, the earliest known evidence of tuberculosis was detected among the human remains found at Atlet Yam. The discovery proves that the disease is at least 3,000 years older than scientists originally thought. Atlet Yam's inhabitants also suffered from malaria and an ear condition related to cold water diving. It appears as though the village was abruptly deserted for reasons that remain unclear to this day. Experts can't seem to agree on what drove residents away. They've considered a multitude of possible factors, including a volcanic eruption and a tsunami. Evidence shows that chronic flooding became a problem in the region around 9,000 years ago, indicating that rising sea levels may have also been an issue for the coastal settlement. Number 4. Water Witch Shipwreck. Sometimes the process of searching for an archaeological artifact or ruin is more mysterious than the object or site itself. This was certainly the case when it came to a steamship that disappeared in 1863, shortly before the Civil War ended. Known as the Water Witch, it got caught in a vicious storm in Lake Huron and plunged 230 feet to the bottom of Saginaw Bay, taking its entire crew of somewhere between 17 and 22 men with it. Shipwreck hunters searched for the Water Witch for over half a century before a 79-year-old man named Dave Trotter finally located it last year. Trotter is one of Michigan's most successful shipwreck hunters. He's found more than 100 missing vessels throughout his career. Speaking with local station WZZM, he said that he spent over 40 years searching for the Water Witch. His interest in finding it peaked after the discovery of its sister ship, the City of Detroit, in 1998. Like the Water Witch, the City of Detroit sank in Saginaw Bay. The ships were captained by a pair of brothers named George and Redmond Ryder. After finding the City of Detroit, Trotter thought it would be easy to locate the Water Witch. But the search dragged on for 23 years while he and his team scoured a 2,500 square mile area of the lakebed. Finally, Trotter spotted an undiscovered wreck and a dive team was dispatched to the site to investigate further. They spent less than half an hour capturing footage of the sunken ship from end to end, hoping to capture the smoking gun evidence of its identity. The divers estimated that the ship was 170 to 180 feet long, which kept it in the running for possibly being the Water Witch. Trotter's team compared the wreck's features with records of the vessel and found that they matched up. They had found the missing ship, which sank just 15 miles from the City of Detroit, despite the two sinking a decade apart from one another. Number 3. Bizarre Holes. While exploring the seabed off the Big Sur, California coast in 2019, a team of experts from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute counted thousands of strange holes in the ocean floor. They already knew these bizarre pockmarks exist. In fact, the first one had been discovered around 20 years earlier, but until recently, scientists were unaware of just how many of them there are. On average, the largest pits measure 600 feet in diameter and 16 feet deep. In a statement, researchers described them as nearly circular and fairly evenly spaced. Altogether, there are over 5,200 large pockmarks spanning a 500 square mile area. Scientists don't know what caused the holes to form or why there are so many of them. In addition to the larger pits, there are around 15,000 smaller pockmarks according to MBARI researchers Eve Lunston and Charles Paul. These so-called microdepressions, which the researchers describe as recently formed erosional features, measure roughly 11 feet across and 3 feet deep on average. but they don't know much else about these strange pits. What do you think they are? Let me know in the comments below. But first, be sure to subscribe. Number 2. Mammoth Tusk. While exploring the Pacific seafloor in 2019, scientists from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute spotted what looked like a mammoth tusk. But they were 185 miles from land when they spotted the object 10,000 feet beneath the waves, begging the question of how it got there in the first place. The team determined that the 3-foot-long tusk belonged to an extinct Columbian mammoth that died around 100,000 years ago. A tusk this old would be an extremely rare find on dry land. The fact that it was found far out into the ocean makes it even more exceptional. It's even more shocking that the artifact wasn't destroyed or buried after sitting on the sea bottom for so long. The dark, frigid, and nearly oxygen-free conditions of the environment kept the tusk remarkably well preserved. In fact, it might be the most intact mammoth tusk ever found in that particular part of North America. Researchers hope that it will teach them more about mammoth lineages. They plan to perform CT scans and will try to extract DNA. This could prove especially helpful because Columbian mammoths are a hybrid of 2 different species, but their origins and when the hybridization began remain unclear. Number 1. Ancient Canoe. Maritime archaeologist Tamara Thompson and her friend were testing underwater scooters last year when the pair spotted what they initially thought was a log. But they realized that it would be strange for a log to have made its way to the bottom of the lake. Suspecting that perhaps it was a man-made wooden object, they decided to gather some colleagues and take a closer look. And it's a good thing they did. The 15-foot-long artifact turned out to be a 1,200-year-old dugout canoe. It's the oldest intact boat ever found in Wisconsin. The team recovered it from its watery resting place 27 feet below the surface, bringing it in contact with the air for the first time since 800 AD. It may have been carved by members of the Ho-Chunk Native American tribe. In the absence of modern tools, the canoe's builders would have burned a tree trunk and then used stone tools to hollow it out. This was a painstaking process that would have taken hundreds of hours and a great deal of skill, according to Wisconsin state archaeologist Jim Skibo. Now that the canoe has been exposed to light and air after spending over a millennium in the cold, dark water, the team is working diligently to ensure its preservation so that it doesn't deteriorate. This is an even more time-consuming process than it was to build the boat in the first place and is expected to take several years. Once it's finished being preserved, it'll probably go on display at a state history museum. Thanks for watching. Have you ever found anything mysterious underwater? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.